It's not the American way to cry about how the culture and the institutions has become degenerate. The American way is to go build something better and stop complaining.
The first introduction of communism into the United States came from pro-slavery Southerners. George Fitzhugh described the slave plantation as, quote, the beau ideal of communism. The single most important reason for hope is what's happening in K-12 education, particularly with regard to homeschooling. The leaders of the revolution are America's homeschool mothers.
The American experiment is unparalleled in political history. It is the single best political engineering experiment ever.
America is the first and only nation in the world that is a philosophy.
All right, what's up, everybody? I am Justin Murphy. This is Other Life. In all of political history, few moments are as singular and consequential as the American Revolution. It's mostly known as a war for independence, but much more than people realize, it was also a philosophical movement. The American founding was a radical application of Enlightenment principles to a new continent, and it gave birth to a semi-global empire. And yet the specific DNA of this philosophical movement is not really widely known or discussed. It stands to reason in my mind that a careful study of this DNA may shed some light on the present and future problems and promises of America. And so to unravel this story, I'm joined today by C. Bradley Thompson, author of a 2019 book called America's Revolutionary Mind, a moral history of the American Revolution and the declaration that defined it. Brad, you argue that the American Revolution was the result of a specific philosophical movement in the colonies, especially indebted to Newton, Bacon, and Locke above all others. And the American founders believed that reason alone could identify with essentially a mathematical certainty the rights of man and the correct laws for governing men, and even the correct threshold at which revolution becomes justified. It was this kind of radical, what you call unified system of thought that really defines the DNA of the American experiment. This is what you call the American mind. And your book is much more nuanced, of course, but for our listeners, just starting off, is there anything you would add or subtract from that as a summary of the main idea here?
Yeah, no, I think, Justin, first, it's great to be with you. And no, I think you've done a fine job in summarizing it. And I guess I could add a few things to what you said. The American colonies between and were primarily British colonies, although there was a smattering of people from Europe, the continent. When the colonies were first founded in the early 17th century, let's say in New England, they were founded by Puritans, radical Protestant 5-point Calvinists who had a certain conception of what a political community was and a certain idea of Christian love that would unify that community. But sometime early in the 18th century, a kind of philosophic tsunami crashed onto American shores. And that philosophic tsunami was essentially the ideas of the British Enlightenment. And as you noted, I would say that the principal texts that influenced 18th century American intellectual culture would have been Francis Bacon's Novum Organum, Sir Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, and then two treatises by Locke, two treatises on government, but also, and maybe most importantly, his essay concerning human understanding. And these texts taken together gave the Americans a certain view of nature and of human nature that was dramatically different from the Puritan understanding of nature and human nature. And the primary Enlightenment idea was that reason, human reason, was capable of discerning and discovering certain laws of nature. Laws of nature, for instance, summed up in Newton's Principia that explain planetary motion and gravitation. But maybe the most important idea that American 18th century colonists got from the Enlightenment and from Locke in particular was that it was also possible to discover certain moral laws of nature. In addition to Newton's scientific or natural laws of nature, it was this sort of secularization, you might say, of moral theory at the end of the 17th century and into the 18th century, which I think was the dominant, the most important philosophic influence on American revolutionaries, such that by the time you get to the 1760s, the Americans are now prepared intellectually for the events that are to follow, right? The actions of the British Parliament from 1764 until, and the Americans viewed those actions of the British Parliament through the prism of the Enlightenment ideas that they had learned primarily from John Locke.
Right. Brilliant. And it's very exciting reading the book. It gives you a new sense of the founders as as philosophers, really. No one thinks about them that way. We know that they were intelligent, we know that they were well read, we know that they famously wrote letters that were interesting and substantial, but very few people really see them as philosophers. And the overall effect that you get from your book is that wow, in these years leading up to the American Revolution, the founders really were much more like philosophers than we give them credit for. They were thinking about human nature and the nature of politics from first principles, and they were all gripped by very specific and radical philosophical convictions that never really had been applied so seriously and literally as they did. What's unique about the American Revolution is, in a way, it's kind of passion behind it, and so that really changed my own mental model of what the revolution really was, and I found that a really cool and fascinating and rather inspiring image of what America really was at its founding. Now, what's also interesting to me, though, is that some of these ideas have not aged so well. And I wonder if this is perhaps a key to some of our contemporary political woes. For instance, John Locke's tabula rasa, which you talk about in the book, it has not aged well. And I think many people would say that it's pretty much plainly false. So the advancement of knowledge since Locke has not fared well for the tabula rasa theory. I think a lot of people would say that it's pretty much plainly false. We know a lot about certain innate dispositions and predispositions, whether those are evolved or what have you. The case for a tabula rasa now seems incredibly weak, I think, to most people. And in fact, it's associated with some of the more idiotic ideas on the contemporary left, for instance. Many people have talked about this. So I'm curious just to ask you, what fraction of contemporary American philosophical chaos is, in fact, rightfully blamed on the founders?
Well, that's a big and that's a hard question. It's interesting in the last decade for sure. What you see now is both the hard left and the hard right rejecting the principles of the American founding, right? So if you just take the moral political principles of, say, the 1619 Project from the hard left, the idea there, of course, is that America was founded in sin, and therefore America is and must be and always will be a sinful nation unless the sin is eradicated, right? And the
Mm,
sin, of course, is slavery. And so that position tells us that everything about the American founding is immoral, it's corrupt. A house divided cannot stand, and a nation that is divided philosophically cannot stand. And so, therefore, from the hard right or the dissident right, the reactionary right, whatever you want to call them, of the last dozen years or so, they have started arguing that the world in which we live today, all of the bad things of the world in which we live today, are a result of the founders' liberalism. So the most famous, most well-known case of this is Patrick Deneen's book on liberalism that he published a few years ago. And basically what he does is he traces a single line from Thomas Jefferson to Jerry Rubin, from the Declaration of Independence to the Port Huron Statement. So in other words, all of the really horrible cultural things that we live with today are ultimately a result of the founders' principles, which I just think is just simply wrongheaded. It's not true. So what you have is both the 1619 Project people and the Cath trads and the followers of the Bronze Age pervert. They simply just don't understand what the principles of the American founding were, which in part was the reason I wrote the book, was to correct the record on exactly what the founders thought. And all of the social and moral maladies that we live with in today's world were not the result of the American founding, but just the opposite. It is the rejection of those principles that has gotten us in this mess today. And that rejection of the founders' principles begins in the late 19th century when the second tsunami of ideas from Europe crashed on American shores. And that second tsunami was the ideas of continental German philosophy, Kant, Hegel, Marx, and Nietzsche. And those ideas that were first spawned in the progressive movement at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century that I think have led to the world in which we live today. But those ideas, those thinkers were explicitly rejecting the principles of the
Okay.
American.
So you don't think there might be a few bad apples in the basket of ideas that seeded the American Revolution? For instance, the tabula rasa. Another example might be this sense of the radical self-sufficiency of reason. I think that this idea that man with reason alone can all identify the same demonstrable ethical principles and just naturally converge on them due to reason alone. That also seems to have not aged terribly well. It seems like in many ways we're increasingly realizing that reason alone is not enough either for the community or for even the individual. And so I just wonder, surely you might be able to give some ground that there were certain kind of premises that the founders held dear and perhaps somewhat over indexed on that kind of ended up being somewhat troublesome for the future of the polity.
Yes, but not the ones that you're concerned about.
Okay, so which were they? Why are the ones I'm mentioning not so worrisome, and which are the ones that are worrisome?
Yeah, well, so first, I'm not at all familiar with the contemporary literature on the tabula rasa, for instance. But my own view of the weaknesses of the American founding really comes down to two things. They didn't sufficiently understand the nature of self interest, rightly understood, as Tocqueville put it. And at the very same time, they tried to sneak into their founding principles the ideas of altruism, the idea that we have a moral obligation to sacrifice our lives, our futures for the sake of somebody else. And this was a remnant of their Puritan past, right? So it's a
Mhm.
remnant of Christian altruism. And that teaching, right, is inherently in conflict with the idea that individuals have a right to their lives and their property and their pursuit of happiness. You can't square the circle of altruism and the right to the pursuit of happiness. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, which is related to it, I would say, is this idea of the common good or the public interest, or what the language of the Constitution, which is the general welfare, right? These concepts, I think, have led to the massive expansion of not just the federal government, but local, state governments and local governments. And this idea of the common good, right, is an open ended, fill in the blank, floating abstraction, which is only determined by those who are in power at any given moment in time. So I do not believe with either the left, who uses the concept of the common good, or of, say, the Thomistic right, who also want to use the concept of the common good. The problem is they can't define it. They can't define what it is. The concept of the common good is defined by whomever is in power any given moment in time, which means that it's just the will either of the majority in the context of the United States, the Democratic Republic, or in the mind of the ruler or the ruling class, whomever that might be.
Okay, so that's interesting. It sounds like what you're saying is that the founders, because they were surfing on this Christian inheritance that they were able to assume the perpetuation of a common good, which in fact over time gets exhausted. And they did not fully prepare for the future in which a polity founded on the rational equilibrium of self interest would one day no longer even have a common good. That's basically what you think happened.
Yeah, I like the way you put it, right? They were surfing along through the end of the 17th and into the 18th centuries. They were surfing along with the notion of Christian love. And the notion of Christian love, right? Just simply put, is that we have a moral duty to sacrifice our lives, our fortunes for the sake of others. And that basic idea is in conflict with the principles, say, of the Declaration of Independence. It's in conflict with the natural rights philosophy of the American Revolution, which begins with the idea of the individual as the primary unit of moral and political value. Whereas both the Christian communalists of the 17th century and the socialist new left communalists of the 20th century, they use the concept of altruism combined with the idea of the common good to say that the community or the public good, the public interest is greater than the sum of the individual parts. right? But this is only known by a few. And that few will use the coercive power of the state to force its view of the public interest on everybody. And that position, that doctrine is simply in contrast with the principles of the American Revolution.
Hey everybody, real quick, I finally finished writing my latest book, The Independent Scholar, and it's the best thing I've written, the most important thing I've written, because it compiles everything I've learned over the past 5 years, figuring out this new lifestyle/business model of mine, working full-time as an independent scholar outside of institutions and on the internet. Since I left academia 5 years ago, I've been experimenting like crazy, testing all different kinds of things. I've done books and courses and subscriptions, and I've tried it all. I've tested every model and I've learned so much. I've made so many mistakes, but I've also done things well, and I've earned a few $100,000 doing all these different things. Now I've really got the model down, the ideal model. I've narrowed it down to what works the best and what's most reproducible for most people. It's just a super practical, focused book, what works and what doesn't work in the most concise and practical format possible. So buy it, order it now online at otherlife.co/scholar. You can also just search for The Independent Scholar book. Maybe add Justin Murphy in there if you want to find it more easily. Otherlife.co/scholar. Go buy The Independent Scholar, the ideal model. Everything I've learned over the past 5 years working full-time as an independent scholar. Thank you. I'm very proud of it. Otherlife.co/scholar. Okay, so here we circle around one of the holes or the limitations or aporias in the American mind. But let's spend some more time talking about the genius of it and really what they got so amazingly right. Because the American experiment is pretty much unparalleled in political history. You could make the case, I think, quite compellingly that it is the single best political engineering experiment ever, right? If you just look at how the world unfolded after that, you can certainly make that case. So is this a kind of experimental vindication of their philosophical wagers? Are we to take the success of the United States, its economic success, its military success, it's just its overarching extraordinary success? Is that evidence that the founders' philosophy was in fact closer to the truth of human life, of human nature, than any other philosophy out there? And if so, what specifically do you think is most vindicated philosophically by the success of America?
Yeah. So, yes, I think there is a direct connection. Ideas, if you begin with the premise, as I do, that ideas have consequences, the ideas of the American founding they percolated down and through American culture at the end of the 18th century and then throughout almost the entirety of the 19th century, at least up until about the 1870s. And so, what you see happening in 19th century America is the flowering existentially of the ideas that are coming out of the American Enlightenment. And so what you get then is a kind of explosion in 19th century America, for instance, of productive ability. The American economy just completely explodes in the 19th century to the point, right, where we go from anybody who's living on the frontier throughout the 19th century is living in a state, in a Hobbesian state of nature, that is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. But within a very short period of time, simply by exerting their minds and their labors to converting nature into the bounty which sustains their lives, they have lived out the idea. So in other words, what you see happening is the ideas of, let's say, I'll put it metaphorically, the ideas of the Declaration of Independence are then carried by several generations of American settlers and pioneers through the Cumberland Gap to to the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, and then eventually over time, over the course of several decades, then crossing the Mississippi, crossing the Great Plains, crossing the Rocky Mountains, eventually getting to the Pacific. So in other words, there is always a frontier in American history. And what you have is the movement of these ideas that are taken over by American pioneers who are living the dream of being self-owning, self-governing, and self-reliant individuals, right? Who are 3 steps removed, certainly, from the central government. And so if you are living, there's a sense in which you can say that there was a frontier in American history from the moment Jamestown was settled in and then up through the end of the 19th century. We have always had a frontier. And that frontier in combination, right, the existential fact of having a frontier where individuals are literally having to self-govern themselves and to be self-reliant, not able to rely on government for their livelihood, combined with the ideas of the founding period, the idea of individual rights and limited government. You take these ideas through the Cumberland Gap at the end of the 18th century, and then you've got several generations of Americans who are living out this idea. And America is the first and only nation in the world that is a philosophy, right? So there's something that we call Americanism. There is no Russianism. There is no Italianism, right? Or Englishism, but there is an Americanism. And this Americanism is the existential embodiment of a philosophy. It's philosophy put into action, right? And the whole story of the 19th century is the story of those ideas being put into practice by everyday, ordinary Americans existentially.
And so the intrinsic American philosophy and practical dynamic is you go to the frontier, you govern yourself more and more, you take on more and more responsibility for yourself. You're always looking to claim more independence to the maximum of what is feasible. And that's interesting. I see that, of course, in American history, but it's interesting because it's not precisely what's in the book. It's not precisely what the founders are saying. It's not precisely natural law and natural right. So a bit of more work could be done to make that connection. Maybe you could try to do that for us. Unpack that a bit more.
Yeah. So that's a lot to unpack. That's about 400 pages worth of unpacking. But why don't we go back to the beginning? Let's go back to the beginning of what we call the American Revolution. So go back to to the end. One of the things that most Americans tend to forget is that those people who were living in or on the American continent, the North American continent, excluding Canada, up until really up until we were all, that is Americans, were subjects of the British realm, right? We were a monarchical society, and people tend to forget that. And as a monarchical society, colonial America through the 17th and 18th centuries was a hierarchical society based on kinship ties, based on sentimental ties of dependence. For most people, the social order into which you were born was the one that you would stay in your entire life. But then something happens. And what happens is the British Parliament passes the Sugar Act, followed a year later by the Stamp Act, a year later after that by the Declaratory Act, and then 2 years later, the Townsend, Tea, and Coercive Acts. So in a very condensed period of time, between 1764 and 1776, the British government passes a series of laws which are intended to extract both power and wealth from the American people. And as I said, the colonists who were living in America were Britons. They were subjects of the British crown. And they accepted the primary philosophic ideas of all Britons at that time, of which I would say there are primarily two. And this is important. Almost all American colonists believed in the idea of the rights of Englishmen, right? And the rights of Englishmen are the rights of a particular people at a particular place and a particular time. And the rights of Englishmen are rights that are embedded in the history, in the 1,000-year history of the British people. And what happened, though, was the Americans very quickly came to reject the idea that they'd held in this belief in the rights of Englishmen, and they adopted the idea of natural rights, the idea that there are rights, moral rights of nature that are absolute, objective, certain, permanent, and universal. And that changed everything, right? So the subtitle of my book is A Moral History of the American Revolution. And to the extent that I contribute anything to the scholarship on the American Revolution, it's this idea of a moral history, and that the most important fundamental way to understand what the Americans were doing during the revolution was that it was a moral revolution. John Adams, looking back on the revolution, once asked the question, so what was the revolution? And he then he says, was the revolution the war? He says, no, the revolution was not the war. The true American Revolution was the revolution that took place in the minds and hearts of the American people. In the 15 years before, which means, this is what my book tries to do, is to recover this moral revolution. And it's intimately connected to the idea of natural rights, right? It's so when the Americans abandoned the idea of the rights of Englishmen and adopted this idea of natural rights, right? Rights that transcend the rights of a particular people at a particular place at a particular time. That is the great mental break,
So
right?
basically, because there are natural rights observable to all, demonstrable, and amenable to our shared reasoning capacities, because those natural rights are observable to all, anytime a political sovereign becomes tyrannical or unjust, it's always the prerogative of any human being to basically take what is rightfully theirs, to escape to the frontier, to enjoy the pursuit of happiness and these values that are self-evident. It sounds like that's basically the connection between natural right and this incessant move to the frontier and this incessant increase of self-reliance that we see in the American story.
Yeah. So what they are doing is at the beginning of the revolution in 1765, they think they are recovering rights they have lost,
Mm,
namely the rights of Englishmen. But then, as I said, they reconceptualize this idea of rights from the rights of Englishmen to natural rights. So then you have to ask the question, well, what are natural rights? Well, the first thing to note is of rights as it comes, let's say, from Locke's second treatise, has certain basic fundamental assumptions. It begins with the individual as the primary unit of moral value, right? Unlike, say, the Puritan communities of the 17th century, which viewed the community, the village, as the primary unit of moral and political value. So they begin with the individual. And the concept of rights, it's a moral principle. And it's a moral principle based on the nature of human nature. It says that it is both necessary and right for individuals to use their minds to explore and to try to understand reality, that it's necessary and right for you to use your free will and your liberty to acquire the things that are necessary to live your life. So it all comes back to the idea of the individual, right? And it's only in America, for instance, that we have this concept of rugged individualism. And the concept of rugged individualism, which you don't see anywhere else in the world, right, is connected to this idea of the natural rights philosophy, the right of individual to their lives and to taking the actions that are necessary to secure their lives, which means having the liberty, the freedom to take those actions, which then means also having the liberty to acquire the existential necessities of life, namely property. And then it also means having the liberty to pursue one's, I'm using this in a non-religious sense, one's spiritual ends and purposes, namely the pursuit of happiness, right? But it all comes back to the individual. The individual has a right to govern himself or herself. And the American idea of self-governance, it's the most radical idea, I think, of modernity. I mean, it completely radicalizes both the Christian and the classical Republican understanding of what a community is.
okay. I love it. And you mentioned a few moments ago that in American history, there's always a frontier. And it got me wondering where the frontier might be today. Obviously, in a certain way, the borders of the nation have been fairly well defined for some time. But is the frontier so significant in the American mind that even once the borders are well defined, that the frontier lives on in our minds. How does it live on? Where is the frontier today? Are there particular issues or maybe geographies or particular dynamics in American culture that represent the frontier today, do you think?
Yeah. So the first thing to note is that the manners and mores that Americans developed throughout the course of the 19th century, the manners and mores associated with this idea of rugged individualism, of the frontier, of radical self-governance and self-reliance, the idea of the self-made man. Right? These are ideas unique to America. You don't see these ideas being developed anywhere else in the world, right? So the manners and mores that Americans developed over the course of the 19th century lived on, continued to live on into the 20th and now into the 21st century. I will say, however, of course, that those manners and mores are starting to wither on the vine. Americans are becoming less self-governing, both as individuals and as political communities. Now, on the question of the frontier, where is the frontier today? Well, it is the case, right, that the physical frontier that Jackson Turner Maine or Frederick Jackson Turner wrote about. He wrote the great book called The Frontier Thesis, which attributed American values to the fact that there had always been a frontier. Then when you get to the end of the frontier, that is to say, when the pioneers and the settlers reach the Pacific Ocean, the question then becomes, well, now what? If the frontier dies, does that mean that the moral values, the manners and mores die as well? Well, first, as I said, they live on and will live on for centuries. Here's the point, specifically answering your last question. There will always be new frontiers, right? And we see the new frontiers all the time. The new frontiers include those places under the oceans. The new frontiers include those places in outer space. Those frontiers include, what you see in a high-powered microscope. Those frontiers continue. I'm holding up my iPhone with a plug for Arsenal Football Club. Those frontiers, right? Inside this phone is a whole world. There's a universe. There is a universe of knowledge inside that phone, right? So as long as the mind is free to pursue knowledge and to seek new knowledge, there will always be frontiers.
There's a lot of talk today about conspiracy theories. And one of the most striking little tidbits in the book was that for the founding fathers, there was a conspiracy theory angle in some of that. It was quite striking. It was interesting to learn that basically the founding fathers subscribed to a kind of conspiracy theory. They were convinced that the British were engaged in a systematic plot to enslave them with a kind of purposeful, malevolent intent. And this was interesting because it wasn't necessarily clear that that was the case, so that they were reading between the lines, connecting the dots as the conspiracy theorists do. And I'll tell you, reading your book, it definitely struck me as rather paranoid. You talk about how they thought they were the freest people in the world, but just a few years later, they claimed that they were being enslaved, not just by accident, but by systematic machinations against them. Is this just the paranoid style of American politics, or what's going on here, especially with connecting that to the prevalence of conspiracy theories today?
Yeah. So you could say that in the context of American history, American revolutionaries were the first conspiratorialists, but I don't view that in a negative way, right? I actually, in a certain sense, I view that in a very positive way, right? But in order to understand how they understood the concept conspiracy, and they used the word conspiracy. They claimed that there was a conspiracy to deny their liberties, right? But they didn't just wing off things. They actually provided evidence. Take the Declaration of Independence, right? You could say that the Declaration of Independence is a conspiratorial document, right? What Jefferson and the other drafters of the Declaration do is they lay out, right, the evidence, right? They're not just winging off with these crazy ideas, but they present real evidence, right? And the evidence goes from 1764 until when you get the British Parliament passing this string of laws, this legislation, and the argument, and certainly in the Declaration, and which they get from Locke, is that one act, let's say the Stamp Act, which is the most famous piece of legislation passed by the British Parliament, one act which infringes on our rights and liberties is not a form of tyranny, right? And two may not be. But when you get in a very short period of time, in a truncated 10-year period, a series of laws that are violating their rights in all kinds of different ways, then it's not unreasonable to assume not only that their rights are being violated, but that there is an approaching tyranny on their rights and liberties. And the other thing that's important to note, and why we in the 20th or the 21st centuries now use terms like the paranoid style to describe American revolutionaries, is that it's hard for 20th and 21st century people to understand what it means to live and to think, live, and act on moral principles. Right. So one of the things that I try to argue in the book is that American revolutionaries, they bridged the traditional dichotomy between principles and practice, between theories and action. And they did it through this concept of the spirit of liberty, right? And this idea of the spirit of liberty is a jealous spirit, and it's jealous of one's freedom. And when one sees your freedom being violated in many ways, like we do today, it's not paranoid, it's not unreasonable to defend yourself, to defend those principles. Now, I will say that after the Declaration of Independence lays out its four self-evident truths, the fourth of which is the right to revolution, the very next word of the following sentence begins with the word prudence. Prudence dictates that you shouldn't just wing off every time the government passes a small tax, or if they every now and then violate a principle. But when there is a long train of abuses, as the Declaration says, that all point in one direction, then you have the right to defend yourself. And that's precisely what they did. And so my own view is that that's not paranoid, that's prudent.
So only the paranoid stay free in the long run is basically what you're saying. It's good to be paranoid. It's good to be paranoid. If you really want to stay free and remain free, you have to be a little bit paranoid, and that's a good thing.
Well, I see your point, although I just wouldn't use myself. I wouldn't use the word paranoid, right?
Okay.
Because paranoid suggests a psychological disorder. And
Sure.
the revolutionary generation, Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, these were not paranoid people. These were people who loved their freedom and were willing to defend it.
I'm curious how you read subsequent philosophical and moral revolutions in later American history, because you talked about how at a certain point there was this massive rejection of the founders' philosophy that occurred in American history. But one can also point to certain moments where it seems like the American mind is just growing and stepping forward or radicalizing even more into itself. So I think of someone like Emerson. I wonder how you read someone like Emerson, who in some way radicalized the American man's claim to mental sovereignty. But you can also think about 20th century struggles, even something like feminism or the Black struggle for civil rights. It seems like there's perpetual tendencies for Americans to make a claim using reason to a reasoned claim to certain inalienable rights, and with a certain kind of spirit of liberty, we might say a spirit of kind of moral righteousness, saying we're not going to take it anymore. We're going to take power for ourselves, whether you like it or not. And so how do you how do you do this accounting? How do you say someone like Emerson is being faithful to the American Revolution, but maybe feminism or the Black or the civil rights struggle was not? Or just how do you do that accounting, and what's going on with these different later movements?
Right. So the first thing I would say is I agree with you that I think Emerson is, in certain ways, the fulfillment of the revolutionary generation, the fulfillment of the idea of radical individualism and self-governance in the fullest most radical sense of the term. I would also include, there are many pre-Civil War people you could include, Thoreau being another one, and maybe most importantly, Frederick Douglass, I would add to that list. They are existentially fulfilling the idea of self-governance in the fullest sense of the term. Now, with the other movements that you've suggested, the 20th century movements, I would hesitate to put them in the same category because I think they have a very different understanding of the nature of rights. They don't view rights as belonging to individuals, but rather rights as belonging to collective entities, to groups. They believe in the idea of collective rights, the rights of women, the rights of blacks, the rights of any of the current grievance industry groups today that claim rights not on behalf of individuals, but on behalf of their status, on behalf of their identity.
So there's something specific about the American philosophy that it prohibits claims to group consciousness or group rights. That's not the American way.
That's right. I mean, that's what they rejected in 1764, 65, when they ultimately rejected the rights of Englishmen, because the idea of the rights of Englishmen does incline in that direction toward the rights of collective entities, right? The rights of Germans, the rights of Frenchmen, those are just nationalized versions of the collective identity notion of rights.
So it's almost like you need the American philosophy is a universalist philosophy about the nature of man, the nature of human beings, which kind of cashes out at the individual level. It makes the individual the unit of analysis. Whereas some of the other claims and moral revolutions that have been attempted within the American frame later they weren't universal enough. You can't. It's not the American way to say we are a group that deserves the same thing as other people. The American way is to say all people have the same natural right. Everyone is entitled to the rights of man, but you can't make specific claims for specific groups being entitled to anything specific, basically.
Yeah, that's right. And it's interesting that the first critics of the Declaration of Independence were Southern slaveholders, right? So beginning in the late 1830s and right up to and through the Civil War, a new philosophy, I would call it a kind of anti-American philosophy, developed in the South. And it rejected down the line it rejected the Enlightenment, and it rejected down the line the principles of the Declaration of Independence. It rejected the idea, let's just take the most important idea. They rejected many, but they rejected the idea of natural rights and the rights of individuals. They believed that primary unit of political value was the state, not the individual, the state as a political unit. And then narrowing it down, they even viewed the idea of plantations having rights and plantation owners having rights. And this is very interesting. The first introduction of communism into the United States came from pro-slavery Southerners. George Fitzhugh, who is, I think, the greatest philosopher of the pro-slavery South, described the slave plantation as, quote, the beau ideal of communism. And the Southern slaveholders were the harshest critics, not only of the principles of the Declaration, but of the freedom philosophy and certainly of laissez-faire capitalism.
Interesting, right? Because the plantation is this sort of perverted communitarianism, right? It's this intensive, like we are a group, we are a family, we have rights within the family, and we shall not, what we do within this family will not be disputed in a way, right? So that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, some of the Southern slaveholders essentially argued for slavery. Now, this was not their term. This is my term, obviously. So it's somewhat ahistorical. But essentially, what they described was a cradle to grave welfare state. That's how they described what the slave plantation was, a cradle to grave welfare state, for which the primary beneficiary was not the slaveholder, but the slave.
Right. Fascinating. So basically, someone like John Brown and the militant abolitionists are finishing the work of the American founders, but you go up to something like the Black Panthers later, they're no longer consistent with the ideas of the founders because their sense of justice that they were looking for and organizing was one that almost in a way return different particular groups into this kind of more sort of communitarian embrace of the state. And that's where they kind of, when you start clamoring for the government to do this and that for all of these different groups, in any once you start talking like that at all, you're violating the American philosophy. But someone like John Brown is really just finishing the job.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think John Brown is finishing the job, or William Lloyd Garrison, who is the philosophic doyen of the abolitionist movement. They saw themselves as explicitly fulfilling the principles of the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I don't know how much you follow the current cutting edge of technology, especially things like cryptocurrency, but I think I'd be remiss not to mention at this point in the conversation that certainly seems to me that something like Bitcoin and these sort of self-enforcing monetary systems essentially are, in my opinion, perfectly representative of the American frontier when it comes to things like finance. And I don't know if you have opinions about that, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I don't. And so, what little I know of cryptocurrencies, my sense of the matter is that what you've just described is correct, that it's certainly a new frontier. Without
Right.
that is is undoubtedly true. And they're also operating outside the confines of state control, which I think also has a connection to the principles of the revolution.
I want to bounce off of you a more open-ended question, just to give you a general prompt to possibly share some thoughts on a larger topic, which is intellectual culture and intellectual economy, because we know that the founding fathers operated in this very interesting context in terms of technology and communication, right? We know that they wrote a lot of letters, and in a lot of ways, the American mind was forged in this kind of decentralized correspondence network. You're a professor at Clemson, but you also read a newsletter yourself. We're currently living through something like some sort of renaissance in independent creative communication, also decentralized on the web. I'm just curious if you have any intuitions or observations or hypotheses about the nature of decentralized intellectual freedom and the American frontier, because it seems like there's just a very tantalizing parallel there.
Yeah, yeah. So that's another new frontier is the new medias that are arising in opposition to, or at least counter to the mainstream media, big media. Take Substack, where I am writing as the redneck intellectual. The Substack is it's an extraordinary new technology, which allows, I don't know how many people are actually on Substack, but I know that at the very least, it's thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people are on Substack. And that ranges from the Barry Weisses and Andrew Sullivans of the world who broke away from the mainstream media to go out and to their own new frontier and create new media centers. And that's what they're doing. But it's not just them, right? It's literally thousands, tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of people who have now been given a platform to launch their voice to whomever they can get to listen to them. And so I think the decentralization of knowledge is a function, a primary function of a free society. And when you get the centralization, the authoritarianism of knowledge, where it's only coming from a few selected power centers that are in fact aided and abetted by government power, then that is definitely a source of potential future tyranny. So the decentralization of knowledge, I think, is a part of the American story. And you're right about the American Revolution. It was a revolution by correspondence in many ways, right? There were committees of correspondence all over the country. So yes, bottom line, decentralization of knowledge and the transference of knowledge is critically important, particularly in today's world, to keeping freedom alive.
I think this is an important point, and I think that there's a cleavage in American politics right now that is more important precisely on this point than a lot of people realize. I think because if you look at, there's a lot of energy right now in political arenas to fight back the woke politics and all of this, and you see people like DeSantis and many different political actors and activists really talking about this, making it a political issue. It's very salient to a lot of people, especially sensitive issues like the trans issue and how children are educated and brought up on these topics. And so I think this is a really live wire, and I just want to make sure people listening get the point here, because you can agree or disagree, Bradley. Brad, I'd like to hear what you think, but it seems to me like American politics right now is way over indexed on the rather un-American obsession with institutions and playing by the normal rules of the established political game. And it seems to me like the real American way is, if you're fed up with something that's happening in the culture or in American politics, go to the frontier and do something better yourself. And I think this is more of a cleavage than people realize, because what it says to me is it's not the American way to cry about how the culture and the institutions has become degenerate. The American way is to go build something better and stop complaining, and don't obsess over trying to fix some American college that you think is sadly overtaken by some bad ideology. Don't get obsessed with that and cry about that and get all fixated and trying to play these games from within institutions that you think are tyrannical or mistaken. Exit those institutions and go to the frontier and build something better. That to me feels like the clear American injunction that I think a lot of people who want to represent American spirit, and they think they represent a kind of American ideal. I think in a lot of ways they're actually fixated on something that is really quite mistaken. Do you find that, or what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. And I'm angry with myself that I didn't bring up when you asked the question about new frontiers, and particularly new frontiers of knowledge, that I forgot to mention the thing that I've invested the most of my time in for the last 25 years, and that's education. So you can see this on two different levels, right? We are living through a time in higher education where our universities are beginning the process of imploding. They are imploding for demographic reasons, they're imploding for ideological reasons. And just when it seemed like all was lost with regard to higher education, along come several new colleges that are being created. So where you are, University of Austin is the best known venture, right? I'm sure it's going to be a stunning success. Rolston College in Savannah, Georgia, just launched last year. And there are several new colleges that are in the process of being created. So this is a great thing. I support it across the board. But more importantly, the single most radical social movement of the last 50 years is the homeschooling movement. It is because the single greatest behemoth in American society and culture is the government school system, right? A government school system which until recently captured the minds of 95% of all American children over the course of 50, 60, 70, well, more than that, 100 years, 150 years, right? And so what we have now is a movement of ordinary, everyday people who are not a part of some elite intellectual movement, who have just, to quote my own slogan, hashtag just walk away. Right? You've got millions just in the last 3 years, 1 million plus people have hashtag just walked away out of the government school system. And they are homeschooling, they are forming micro school education pods, right? This is a new frontier. This is the new frontier in education. And there is nothing more important in American culture than how we educate children. And at a time in our history when it's easy to be very pessimistic about the future of the United States, there is reason for hope in that. And the single most important reason for hope is what's happening in K-12 education, particularly with regard to homeschooling. And the leaders, I will say one last thing, the leaders of the revolution are America's homeschool mothers. This is a woman-led movement that is changing the face of American culture.
That's so inspiring. And I think you're absolutely right. There are all of these frontiers out there available today in America. America still has many frontiers. And I love how you talk about education in particular as one of the most exciting. And I tend to completely agree. Certainly been the orientation of myself and the Other Life Project for sure is take matters into your own hands and don't get fixated complaining about things that you dislike. That's not the American way. I really appreciate, Brad, that you've given us a substantial erudite gloss on precisely that intuition that I've had myself for quite some time. So this was awesome. We covered a lot of ground, and I think that was a perfect conclusion on some of the most exciting opportunities out there today for people with whom this message resonates. So the book again is America's Revolutionary Mind: a moral history of the American Revolution and the declaration that defined it. I will put a link to the book in the show notes so you can easily find it and go and buy it if you enjoyed this conversation. And also, Brad writes a newsletter, as you mentioned before. You can find that at cbradleythompson.substack.com. I will also put a link to that in the show notes. Brad, thank you so much. This was edifying and inspiring. And I've been meaning to do a proper podcast on this book for a long time. So I'm glad we got it done.
Yeah, Justin, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, everyone. I'm Justin Murphy. This is Other Life. All right.